So I'm going to run through this, and everything that you need to know in the sheep brain, you also need to know in the human brain, but it's the same orientation and the same landmarks. It's the same tools, okay? And so, there may be plates like this, right, that have structures that aren't necessarily marked on here, but I could ask you to identify them, right? And so, as long as you use your tools that we give you, you'll be fine. All right, so we're going to start with the top of the brain, the sheep brain. And first of all, we're going to orientate, right? So how do we know that we're looking at the dorsal side of the brain? Well, we can see all the cortex and we can see the cerebellum back here, right? If we're looking at the ventral side of the brain, it looks very different, right? We see all these midbrain and brainstem structures. We can't see the cerebellum except for the flocculus over here. So first thing is to orientate, am I looking at the top or the bottom of the brain? I don't think there's any structure today that you can identify from both the top and the bottom. Okay? So it's either a top structure or a bottom structure. Okay? All right, the first one is the longitudinal fissure. These are the cerebral hemispheres on the left and the right, and this big fissure in between them, and it's kind of, you really don't want to take it apart because it's kind of connected, but this big fissure in between them is the longitudinal fissure. Can you grab me a pen, just any number pen, random number pen out of there? And so if I had a pen stuck there like that, and it said fissure sulcus on the key on your test, then that would be longitudinal fissure. Okay? Yes. All right. Now, inside the longitudinal fissure is the corpus callosum. I'm not going to mark that this week, even though I think it is in blue on your thing because it's really hard to see. Next week when we do a mid-sagittal cut, you'll learn the corpus callosum. So don't worry about that this week. Okay, the next thing is looking at the separation of the frontal lobe and the rest of the brain. And like I mentioned, in a sheep brain, this is not centrally located. It's about 1/3 and 2/3 of the brain. That's why we don't call it the central sulcus. It runs perpendicular, makes a T shape with the longitudinal fissure. Okay? And so we call that the cruciate sulcus or cruciate fissure. Okay? I'm going to turn the brain around this way so we can kind of look at it. Again, we're orientating. The cruciate fissure is in the anterior part of the brain. Dorsal anterior part of the brain. Within the frontal lobe, there are 3 gyri. And each of those on each side is 1/3 of the frontal lobe. 1, 2, 3. Lots of thirds here. Okay? And so here we have 1 gyri. Here we have the next gyri, the middle gyri. So we have superior, that's most medial, then middle, then inferior over here. Separating the superior and middle frontal gyri is the superior sulcus. Superior frontal sulcus. So if I were to mark the superior frontal sulcus, I would have a pin stuck in like that. Right? It is clearly in the sulcus. You can see your landmarks of superior and middle sulcus here. It's not near the cruciate fissure up there. Right? If I'm going to mark the cruciate fissure, I'm going to mark it here. Okay? I will never put a pin at the juncture of the cruciate and the superior frontal sulcus. I'm not trying to, believe me, I'm really trying to be obvious with this. Okay? Yes, Becca?
Does the gyri or gyrus go like, you were trying to say on a gyri, to go all the way down with it too?
Yeah, so you have to use your imagination, and this is why no 2 brains are alike, right? Because the superior frontal sulcus, it kind of stops here on this side, kind of makes a curve this way, but really it would continue, you think about it as like an imaginary line of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Over here, it comes all the way down, and you kind of have a nicer, superior frontal gyrus, right? So even on this brain, the left and the right side don't look the same. That's why I'm saying you have to use your landmarks. Okay, you have to go through that process. Again, the middle frontal gyrus goes all the way through here, even though there's a sulcus running across there, and the inferior would be over here. So how do you know if it's inferior or middle? Well, if it's marked in the 1, 2, 3, the lateral third of the frontal lobe, and it says gyrus, then that would be the inferior frontal gyrus. If it's in the middle third, that would be the middle frontal gyrus. On the other side, it goes in the same direction away from the midline. So superior, middle, inferior. Now I'm going to tell you something that people get mixed up, and hopefully no one in here will get it mixed up. Because if I have a pin stuck kind of over here in the side, you orientate and say, okay, top of the brain, lateral most part, that should be inferior frontal gyrus, and you're correct. Okay? On the bottom part of the brain, there's this place here which we call the orbital gyri over here. And when I mark it, it's going to be marked like this. Okay? Sometimes people forget if they're looking at the top or the bottom of the brain, and they just see a pin stuck out to the side and they go, inferior frontal gyrus. No, you cannot see the inferior frontal gyrus from the bottom of the brain, from the ventral part of the brain. Okay? I will never mark the inferior frontal gyrus like that. I won't do it because you don't have any landmarks. You can't tell what it is. You have to be able to see the cruciate fissure, the longitudinal fissure, superior, middle, and inferior in order to make that distinction. Same thing with the orbital gyri. I'll never mark the orbital gyri from the top. It's not a top view structure. Okay? Moving backwards. The supracilium sulcus is back here in the posterior part of the brain, and it runs parallel to the longitudinal fissure. But it's not on the midline, it's over in the cortex. Now, how do you know if this sulcus or this sulcus is the supracilium sulcus? How would you know if I mark this or if I mark this that it's the supracilium sulcus? It's kind of a trick question. It's the only sulcus you need to know in the posterior part of the dorsal brain. So if there's a pin in a sulcus and it's not the longitudinal fissure and you're not in the frontal lobe, it has to be the supracilium sulcus. That's why I'm saying you can't just memorize and go, that line is the supracilium sulcus. Because on this brain, there may be 5 different lines across there. So if I mark that one, or I mark that one, it's the same. All you have to do is put supracilium. That way I know you're using your landmarks, right, to know that I'm on the dorsal part of the brain, posterior to the cruciate, and it's not on the midbrain, it's not the longitudinal fissure, it's the supracilium. Okay? All right. The 10 through 14 of that section, the lobes, I'm only going to mark lobes on human brain plates. I'm not going to mark lobes in the sheep brain because they don't have a very big temporal lobe and the definitions are hard to see. So I'm only going to mark lobes on the human brain. Okay? That's everything on the cerebral cortex on the top part. So we're going to flip over to the bottom part. Okay? Now, I told you that there's no structure to be marked from the top and the bottom, and that's a lie. There's one that can be, and that is the lateral fissure. The lateral fissure is the lateral most fissure, and it really separates the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is very, very small. You all see that? The temporal lobe, here in this sheep brain, it's just one little gyrus. Right? That's one difference between human and sheep brain. So this is actually the hippocampus. We call it the hippocampal gyrus because it's on the surface of the sheep brain. But in the human brain, if I can hold this like that, this is temporal lobe. Where it's cut there is the lateral sulcus, that big thing separating temporal from parietal and frontal. Big temporal lobe, inside the temporal lobe is the hippocampus. You can't see it in the human brain. The temporal lobe wraps around it because we have big temporal lobes. What do you think the temporal lobe's function is? Anyone watch my lecture yet? It does do hearing.
And you also said it stores memory.
Stores memory. So you think sheep have very good memory? Very tiny temporal lobes, right? Humans have very big temporal lobes. Probably don't have the same memory capacity as us.
So we don't need to know the pre-central and post-central on the sheep?
No. But you do need to know that on here. And I do have a section that is 16 is specific human gyri. That's only going to be on human brains.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you show the lateral fissure one more time?
On the sheep brain?
Yes.
Yes. So the lateral fissure is going to be over here on the side, lateralmost side of the brain. And yes, you will be able to see it. It'll be marked like that. And it'll look like that in the tray because it's on the lateralmost side. Okay? Clearly different than supersylvian. Supersylvian's way up on the top part. Lateral way down here. Okay? You can see the lateral from the top. You can see the lateral from, I can mark it from the top to the bottom. You kind of have to look to the side to see it, but it's the only thing on the posterior part of the brain coming out the side, and I'll say the fissure of sulcus. Okay? The other fissure is the rhinal fissure, which I said this, so you can see these two lobes here on the bottom of the brain. Those are the hippocampus. The hippocampus on either side. And you see how it looks different than gyri? When you get your brain, you'll see it's a different type of structure. It's not a cortical structure, cortex structure. So the fissure or sulcus separating the hippocampus from the temporal lobe, it's called the rhinal fissure. The rhinal fissure. So in the posterior part of the brain, you have so far 3 sulci or fissures that you could have to identify. The rhinal fissure can only be seen from the bottom of the brain and is right next to the hippocampus. The lateral fissure can be seen from the bottom or the top and is lateralmost. It's not going to be near the hippocampus. It's going to be on the lateral part. And then, and on top, same thing. And then the suprasylvian fissure, which is only going to be on the top of the brain, and it's going to be parallel to the longitudinal fissure.
So rhino separates the hippocampus and the inferior temporal?
Yes, but you're not going to see an inferior. This has 1 gyrus for the temporal lobe, not 3. Okay. So you're only going to see the superior, middle, and inferior temporal lobe in the human brain.
Okay.
And I won't mark the temporal lobe or the temporal gyri at all on the sheep brain. They're just not there. It's too difficult to do. Okay? All right. I already showed you the orbital gyri, which are up here. This is where the eyes would have been. That's what that indentation is. This is where the orbits and the eyes and the skull are. And so there's a lot of gyri in there. We're not differentiating them. We're just calling them all orbital. So if there's a pin stuck over on the side and a gyrus in the anterior part of the bottom ventral part of the brain, then that is the orbital gyri. Okay? All right. Since I'm on the bottom of the brain, let's skip over cerebellum, and we'll do that last. And I'll come back to the specific human gyri and do those last 2. All right, so if you go down to part C, where it says rhynencephalon, this is where we're going to pick up. So, and now we're orientated. What part of the brain are we looking at? Ventral, bottom. All bottom now. We've done top. Segregated out. Orientated. These are structures you can only see from the bottom of the brain. Okay. Some of the sheep have more defined olfactory bulbs, this sort of flappy, smooth structure at the anterior part of the brain, than others. This sheep's got kind of torn up in the process of taking the brain out of the skull. All right? So, this might be the brain that you're looking at and studying. Probably not going to be the one I mark olfactory bulb on because it's not a very good example. Right? So I would be more likely to use something like this, where I could stick it right in there and you would see that it's in the olfactory bulb. Okay? Underneath the olfactory bulb are two gyri. So what fissure is this on the midline? Longitudinal. It's all the way around. Longitudinal fissure. On either side of the longitudinal fissure, under the olfactory bulb, are two olfactory gyri, and you have to say medial or lateral olfactory gyrus in order to be correct. It's not correct if you say olfactory gyrus because they're specific. It's either going to be the medial or the lateral. And remember, the medial are beside each other, the lateral are apart from each other on either side. Back.
So the orbital is wider or more lateral.
Yes,
than
they will be lateral in the orbits. Directly under the olfactory bulb, you have those two gyri that are on either side, even on these chewed up ones, right? That's either side of the longitudinal fissure. Orbital will be over here. Okay? Okay. Now, from the olfactory bulb, there is this smooth tract. It's a nerve tract. It's the olfactory tract that runs in and goes under the hippocampal gyrus. On this one, it kind of looks like they run together, but it's actually going under the hippocampal gyrus. Over here, goes under the hippocampal gyrus. Some of these are more pronounced than others. This is a nice one. Nice olfactory tract goes under the hippocampus. Nice olfactory tract goes under the hippocampus. Right? I call that the hippocampal gyrus in the sheep because it's on the surface, but it's the hippocampus. But on your answer key for the sheep brain, it'll say gyrus next to it because it's referred to as the hippocampal gyrus. Okay? This in the longitudinal fissure, this big white X almost looking structure, if they hadn't cut the nerves off, is the optic nerves and the optic tract, and right in the middle is the optic chiasm. And in some sheep brains it makes a better X. This one you can kind of see the X where they cut the nerve. This is the optic tract. This is the optic chiasm. So if I was marking optic chiasm, it would be midline, right in the middle of optic nerves and tract, right at the center, X.
Would you mark the hippocampal gyrus in between the tract and the hippocampus?
This area,
Yeah.
that's not the hippocampus. I'm going to get to that in a second. This bulge right here is the
Yeah.
hippocampus.
Yeah, where would you
I would mark the hippocampus dead center in the
put
hippocampus.
the gyrus?
That is the hippocampal gyrus in the sheep brain because it's on the surface.
Gotcha,
It's
okay.
one and the same. Now, the area that I just pointed at that sort of makes a triangle or trapezoid shape, the boundaries of that, this is your landmark, longitudinal fissure, olfactory tract, optic nerve, hippocampus, this area here is called the anterior perforated substance. And if you look really closely, maybe I'll see this one. There's like little holes. When you have your brain, you can look at it. It's perforated. There's little holes on it. But don't rely on seeing it perforated because you can't always see that. But that's why it's called that. And so that, again, would be marked with the boundaries of the olfactory nerve, the hippocampal gyrus, the optic nerve, and the longitudinal fissure, that part that's in front, anterior to the optic nerve and the hippocampus.
What was it called?
the anterior perforated substance. Okay? Okay, so moving on to what's labeled brainstem in your handout, we talked about the optic chiasm. Right behind the optic chiasm, I'm going to use both of these brains here. Right? So optic chiasm. Right behind that is a hole. Sometimes it's not a hole, sometimes it's more of a structure like that. That is the infundibulum. It's fun, people. Remember, it's fun. It's the infundibulum. It's fun because it connects your hypothalamus to your pituitary gland. Okay, but it's been cut off. The pituitary gland's been cut off. But that's the connection between your brain and your endocrine system and your pituitary gland. That's why we want to learn it. I'm not asking you to learn anything in here because I'm trying to haze you or I'm trying to make your life miserable. Every structure we're learning in here, we're going to talk about in class, and you need to know where it is, and that's why we're learning it in here. It's not like an exercise and trying to weed people out or something. Okay? It's really important. There's no extraneous material that I'm asking you to learn in. Okay, I promise. So the infundibulum, it's fun. It's right in the middle, and it's in between the optic chiasm and this white matter right here. And this white bulge, it's really two bulges, which are real prominent in the human brain, but in the sheep brain they kind of mesh together to form one big white bump. And those are called the mammillary bodies. So you have the infundibulum in between the mammillary bodies and the optic chiasm. Okay? Yes. Infundibulum in between the optic chiasm and the mammillary bodies. The mammillary bodies are a distinct white midline bump on the bottom of the brain. Yes?
And for the mammillary bodies, you can label either one?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's really hard to see. I'll usually put it in like that. I mean, it's kind of a singular structure almost in the sheep brain. The human, they're separated apart from each other, and you can actually see two little fists poking out of the brain. All right. This big V-shaped structure, it almost has a rope-like or cord-like appearance, is called the cerebral peduncles. The word peduncle, it's a funny word, it means connector. Peduncle, it's a connector. It connects your brain stem and spinal cord with your cerebral hemispheres. So it goes from the pons of the brain stem and carries the signals back and forth to the upper part of the brain. So this rope structure on either side, rope-like V, like that, is the cerebral peduncles. Okay. Just behind the cerebral peduncles, there's a belt-like structure that sticks out, and that's called the pons. P-O-N-S, pons. Yeah.
So if you were to label the cerebral peduncle, would you put it in the V part? Would you put it?
Yeah, I wouldn't put it back here. That's too close to. Oh, sorry. I wouldn't put it back there because that's real close to the pons.
Okay.
I put it up here.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to be clear, right? In the V part. So this is a slightly different pons, but the pons always sticks out, right, and protrudes some. In fact, you can see here on this one, that bump that's sticking out there, that's the pons sticking out. All right, so that's pons. This whole area here, that's a trapezoid, this is spinal cord, okay? In between the pons and the spinal cord, and I'm not marking spinal cord, is the area called the medulla. And there's three things that can be marked on the medulla. One is easy because it's a fissure, and it'll say fissure or sulcus. And it's even easier because what side of the brain are we on? Okay, and where's the fissure located? On the midline. It's the ventral median fissure. If you orientate, you should never get that wrong. Ventral side, midline, median, fissure. Ventral median fissure. Okay? On either side of the ventral median fissure are two tracts, two sort of raised lines going down there, and those are called the pyramids. So if I were to mark a pin here, it doesn't say sulcus or fissure, so you're not confused that it's in that, okay? It's not a gyrus, so it doesn't say gyrus, it doesn't say anything next to it. It's just a structure. That would be the pyramid. If I have the pin marked way over here on the lateral side, that is the medulla. Okay? The pyramid is part of the medulla, but if I have the pin in the pyramid and you put medulla, it's wrong, because it's a more specific part. It's the pyramid of the medulla. So if I'm marking medulla, it'll always be away from the midline. You'll be able to see the pyramids as your landmark, and it'll be over here lateral. Yes?
Do we need to put medulla or the full name?
Medulla is fine. All right. We're getting there, people. All right, cerebellum. Gotta love your cerebellum, otherwise you couldn't move, you couldn't be coordinated, have a hard time learning simple things. When looking from the ventral side, we're staying on the bottom, the only part of the cerebellum that's visible when it's attached to the brain is this area right here that hangs over the edge, and it has a funny name called the flocculus. Some of these are fun to say. Everybody say flocculus. Say infundibulum. Flocculus. It just rolls off the tongue. It's like good. They're increasing your vocabulary. So here we have the flocculus. How do I know it's a flocculus? Well, it's stuck in the cerebellum, and we're looking at the ventral side of the brain. It's the only thing that it can be if the brain's attached, if the cerebellum is attached to the brain. Okay? You good on flocculus? All right, let's roll it over. Okay, parts of the cerebellum. Each cerebellum, you see that these are all kind of different. They're all kind of leaning one way or another. Okay? All of them have a raised ridge, ring around the middle, and that ring around the middle is called the vermis. The vermis. All the way around the center part of the cerebellum is called the vermis.
The gyrus.
Yeah, it's a raised ring. These look a little bit, they look kind of like gyri, but they're a little different. You'll see when you can see them up close, right? So right here. On either side, lateral, are the anterior and posterior lobes of the cerebellum. What separates the anterior and posterior lobes of the cerebellum is the fissure prima. The fissure prima is a little bit hard to see. It runs around here. It's usually easiest to see running through the vermis. And that separates 1/3 from 2/3, another 1/3, 2/3, anterior, posterior, right? Anterior lobe, posterior lobe. Okay? I'm not going to put a pin here and say, what part of the cerebellum lobe is that? Okay, I won't do it, I promise you. It'll either be anterior in front of the fissure prima, or it'll be posterior behind the fissure prima.
Can you point out the fissure prima?
Yes, let me show you this one. So it's a fissure that runs across the brain here. It's usually most prominent through the vermis, but again, it's the only fissure or sulcus in the cerebellum. So if you have a pin that's stuck in the cerebellum up here and it says fissure sulcus, it has to be fissure prima. Okay? It has to be fissure prima. Almost done. Now, here we have a brain. What's wrong with this brain? Yeah, lost the cerebellum. So, if I were to put its cerebellum back on, okay, and take it off, you can see that white shiny substance that's been cut in order to take the cerebellum off, which on the cerebellum is this area here and this area here. And on the brainstem is this area here and this area here. That is called the middle peduncles. I didn't make this stuff up. If I made it up, it'd be called the cerebellum peduncle. But I didn't make it up. Someone else made it up. And it's called the middle peduncle. What are the other peduncles we talked about? The cerebellar peduncles are the V shape, the ropes that are going from the pons up into the cerebellum, right? The middle peduncle, don't get them confused, attaches the cerebellum. Okay? On a brain, a cerebellum that's been cut like this, what is the center part here? The ring that goes all the way around the center. The vermis. Except for the part right in between the middle peduncles, which is called the nodule. It's N-O, it's on there. It's, sorry, first page. Yeah, go back to first page. Number 6 under B, nodule. Kind of looks like a nodule. It's like a button sticking up there. And there's middle peduncles on either side. And then what's this thing over here hanging off the side of the middle peduncles? The flocculus! Because remember, if this was attached, we'd be looking at the bottom of the brain there. So when we detach it, that's the flocculus hanging over each side. Okay? If we flip this over, fissure prima, anterior, posterior lobe, all of this is vermis. Okay? In looking at, I'm just going to leave that guy kind of propped up there. Down. Okay. Cerebellum. So when you're looking at the bottom of the cerebellum that's been cut off, the shiny stuff on either side is the middle peduncle, the nodules in the middle. What is this? I'm not going to mark vermis there. I'm not going to be like, is this vermis or is this nodule? I'm not. If you're looking at this part of the brain and it's stuck here, it's the nodule. I'm going to mark the vermis and I'm going to mark it on the top, right where it's not. I'm not sure. And then the flocculus is out here to the side, right? Flocculus, middle peduncle nodule, middle peduncle flocculus. And that's what we see here, right? Nodule, middle peduncle, flocculus. Any questions? All right. Last thing I want to show you before we get started are human brain specific ones. This is 7-3, okay? I'll do it up here. Let's see the way to do this. Here we have the central sulcus, the most centrally located sulcus, right? It's not one of the things on here. That doesn't mean I can't mark it on the quiz on this slide, okay? So don't think that the only thing I'm going to mark on 7-3 are these things that are over here. That's not right, okay? This is a great one to go through and name everything, okay? This is frontal lobe, separated by the central sulcus. What's behind the frontal lobe? Parietal lobe. What's in the back part of the brain? Occipital lobe. What's this part of the brain? Right. Now, on the exam, I could have a plate that you would get to a station and it would look like, I wouldn't have answers, that's for sure. But it might look like this, okay? And so here, I'm saying, number one, this lobe, it's not confusing. I'm not asking for a gyrus. or sulcus. I'm asking for what lobe is that, right? Same thing here. What is this lobe? Okay, all right. Here I'm asking, what is this sulcus? Okay. I could also ask you, I'll show you that one. We go back to this one. Within the lobe, there are gyri that you need to know. So just like in the sheep brain, in the frontal lobe, think of thirds: superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, inferior frontal gyrus. What separates the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe? Lateral fissure. And then we have superior, middle, inferior temporal gyri. Okay? Good. Back here, at the corner of parietal, occipital, and temporal, it's this kind of unique gyrus called the angular gyrus. Think about it, it's like at an angle of all three lobes. Angular gyrus. Okay? This is another picture, right, that shows specifically the angular gyrus because it's involved with language system. And the other parts of the language system are Wernicke's area, which is outlined here, and Broca's area that's outlined here, and the connector between the two, which is inside the brain, right? But it's this line, it's this connection, which is called the arcuate fasciculus. Okay? Those are specific to the human. Sheep don't speak much English, right? I don't know what language they have, but they don't have these same areas in their brain. Okay? All right? So, if I were to ask you, so I could have a sheet like this. So if this said sulcus or fissure, what would number 1 be? Lateral, right? If number 2 said gyrus, what would it be? Middle temporal gyrus. You guys are ready to take 5 times more? If it was in number 3, what would it be? Angular gyrus, right? If I were to ask you for Broca's area or Wernicke's area, I'm going to actually use this slide where it's outlined. I'm not going to use this and just say, what's this area? Right? That's not fair. Okay? So this is the one that I'll mark the language pathway with. Okay? All right? Again, like this is another orientation. Here you need to orientate. Now I'm looking down on the brain, longitudinal fissure, okay, central sulcus. This is not really a fair one. I probably wouldn't use this because what landmark are you missing? How can you tell if you're looking at an anterior or posterior? There's no cerebellum shown. That's not really fair, right? You need that to know anterior, posterior. That's one of your landmarks. Okay? All right. That's really because the cerebellum's underneath. Okay, I think I'm done. I'm going to stop. We good? Any other questions?